Chapter 64. The Boer War. I must skip many other experiences of the period between 1897 and 1899 and come straight to the Boer War. When the war was declared, my personal sympathies were all with the Boers, but I believed then that I had yet no right, in such cases, to enforce my individual convictions. I have minutely dealt with the inner struggle regarding this in my History of the Satyagraha in South Africa, and I must not repeat the argument here. I invite the curious to turn to those pages. Suffice it to say that my loyalty to the British rule drove me to participation with the British in that war. I felt that, if I demanded rights as a British citizen, it was also my duty, as such, to participate in the defense of the British Empire. I held then that India could achieve her complete emancipation only within and through the British Empire. So I collected together as many comrades as possible, and with very great difficulty got their services accepted as an ambulance corps. The average Englishman believed that the Indian was a coward, incapable of taking risks or looking beyond his immediate self-interest. Many English friends, therefore, threw cold water on my plan. But Dr. Booth supported it wholeheartedly. He trained us in ambulance work. We secured medical certificates of fitness for service. Mr. Lawton and the late Mr. Escombe enthusiastically supported the plan, and we applied at last for service at the front. The government thankfully acknowledged our application, but said that our services were not then needed. I would not rest satisfied, however, with this refusal. Through the introduction of Dr. Booth, I called on the Bishop of Natal. There were many Christian Indians in our corps. The bishop was delighted with my proposal and promised to help us in getting our services accepted. Time, too, was working with us. The Boer had shown more pluck, determination, and bravery than had been expected, and our services were ultimately needed. Our corps was 1,100 strong, with nearly 40 leaders, about 300 were free Indians, and the rest indentured. Dr. Booth was also with us. The corps acquitted itself well. Though our work was to be outside the firing line, and though we had the protection of the Red Cross, we were asked at a critical moment to serve within the firing line. The reservation had not been of our seeking. The authorities did not want us to be within the range of fire. The situation, however, was changed after the repulse at Speenkop, and General Buller sent the message that, though we were not bound to take the risk, government would be thankful if we would do so and fetch the wounded from the field. We had no hesitation, and so the action at Speenkop found us working within the firing line. During these days we had to march from 20 to 25 miles a day, bearing the wounded on stretchers. Amongst the wounded we had the honor of carrying soldiers like General Woodgate. The corps was disbanded after 6 weeks' service. After the reverses at Speenkop and Valkrans, the British Commander-in-Chief abandoned the attempt to relieve Ladysmith and other places by summary procedure, and decided to proceed slowly, awaiting reinforcements from England and India. Our humble work was at the moment much applauded, and the Indians' prestige was enhanced. The newspapers published laudatory rhymes with the refrain, "We are sons of empire after all." General Buller mentioned with appreciation the work of the corps in his dispatch, and the leaders were awarded the War Medal. The Indian community became better organized. I got into closer touch with the indentured Indians. There came a greater awakening amongst them, and the feeling that Hindus, Musulmans, Christians, Tamilians, Gujaratis and Sindhis were all Indians and children of the same motherland took deep root amongst them. Everyone believed that the Indians' grievances were now sure to be redressed. At the moment the white man's attitude seemed to be distinctly changed. The relations formed with the whites during the war were of the sweetest. We had come in contact with thousands of Tommies. They were friendly with us and thankful for being there to serve them. I cannot forbear from recording a sweet reminiscence of how human nature shows itself at its best in moments of trial. We were marching towards Cheveley Camp where Lieutenant Roberts, the son of Lord Roberts, had received a mortal wound. Our corps had the honor of carrying the body from the field. It was a sultry day, the day of our march. Everyone was thirsting for water. There was a tiny brook on the way where we could slake our thirst. But who was to drink first? We had proposed to come in after the Tommies had finished. But they would not begin first and urged us to do so, and for a while a pleasant competition went on for giving precedence to one another. Chapter 65. Sanitary Reform and Famine Relief. It has always been impossible for me to reconcile myself to any one member of the Bedi politic remaining out of use. I have always been loath to hide or connive at the weak points of the community or to press for its rights without having purged it of its blemishes. Therefore, ever since my settlement in Natal, I had been endeavoring to clear the community of a charge that had been leveled against it, not without a certain amount of truth. The charge had often been made that the Indian was slovenly in his habits and did not keep his house and surroundings clean. The principal men of the community had, therefore, already begun to put their houses in order, but house-to-house inspection was undertaken only when plague was reported to be imminent in Durban. This was done after consulting and gaining the approval of the city fathers, who had desired our cooperation. Our cooperation made work easier for them and at the same time lessened our hardships. For whenever there is an outbreak of epidemics, the executive, as a general rule, get impatient, take excessive measures and behave to such as may have incurred their displeasure with a heavy hand. The community saved itself from this oppression by voluntarily taking sanitary measures. But I had some bitter experiences. I saw that I could not so easily count on the help of the community in getting it to do its own duty, as I could in claiming for it rights. At some places I met with insults, at others with polite indifference. It was too much for people to bestir themselves to keep their surroundings clean. To expect them to find money for the work was out of the question. These experiences taught me, better than ever before, that without infinite patience it was impossible to get the people to do any work. It is the reformer who is anxious for the reform, and not society, from which he should expect nothing better than opposition, abhorrence, and even mortal persecution. Why may not society regard as retrogression what the reformer holds dear as life itself? Nevertheless, the result of this agitation was that the Indian community learned to recognize more or less the necessity for keeping their houses and environments clean. I gained the esteem of the authorities. They saw that, though I had made it my business to ventilate grievances and press for rights, I was no less keen and insistent upon self-purification. There was one thing, however, which still remained to be done, namely, the awakening in the Indian settler of a sense of duty to the motherland. India was poor, the Indian settler went to South Africa in search of wealth, and he was bound to contribute part of his earnings for the benefit of his countrymen in the hour of their adversity. This the settler did during the terrible famines of 1897 and 1899. They contributed handsomely for famine relief, and more so in 1899 than in 1897. We had appealed to Englishmen also for funds, and they had responded well. Even the indentured Indians gave their share to the contribution, and the system inaugurated at the time of these famines has been continued ever since, and we know that Indians in South Africa never failed to send handsome contributions to India in times of national calamity. Thus service of the Indians in South Africa ever revealed to me new implications of truth at every stage. Truth is like a vast tree, which yields more and more fruit, the more you nurture it. The deeper the search in the mine of truth, the richer the discovery of the gems buried there, in the shape of openings for an ever greater variety of service. Chapter 66. Return to India. On my relief from war duty, I felt that my work was no longer in South Africa but in India. Not that there was nothing to be done in South Africa, but I was afraid that my main business might become merely money-making. Friends at home were also pressing me to return, and I felt that I should be of more service in India. And for the work in South Africa, there were, of course, Messrs. Khan and Mansuklal Naezer. So I requested my co-workers to relieve me. After very great difficulty, my request was conditionally accepted, the condition being that I should be ready to go back to South Africa if, within a year, the community should need me. I thought it was a difficult condition, but the love that bound me to the community made me accept it. The Lord has bound me with the cotton thread of love, I am his bond slave, sang Mirabai. And for me, too, the cotton thread of love that bound me to the community was too strong to break. The voice of the people is the voice of God, and here the voice of friends was too real to be rejected. I accepted the condition and got their permission to go. At this time I was intimately connected only with Natal. The Natal Indians bathed me with the nectar of love. Farewell meetings were arranged at every place, and costly gifts were presented to me. Gifts had been bestowed on me before when I returned to India in 1899, but this time the farewell was overwhelming. The gifts of course included things in gold and silver, but there were articles of costly diamond as well. What right had I to accept all these gifts? Accepting them, how could I persuade myself that I was serving the community without remuneration? I 11 the gifts, excepting a few from my clients, were purely for my service to the community, and I could make no difference between my clients and co-workers, for the clients also helped me in my public work. One of the gifts was a gold necklace worth 50 guineas, meant for my wife. but even that gift was given because of my public work, and so it could not be separated from the rest. The evening I was presented with the bulk of these things, I had a sleepless night. I walked up and down my room deeply agitated, but could find no solution. It was difficult for me to forego gifts worth hundreds. It was more difficult to keep them. And even if I could keep them, what about my children? What about my wife? They were being trained to a life of service and to an understanding that service was its own reward. I had no costly ornaments in the house. We had been fast simplifying our life. How then could we afford to have gold watches? How could we afford to wear gold chains and diamond rings? Even then I was exhorting people to conquer the infatuation for jewelry. What was I now to do with the jewelry that had come upon me? I decided that I could not keep these things. I drafted a letter, creating a trust of them in favor of the community and appointing Parsi Rustamji and others trustees. In the morning I held a consultation with my wife and children and finally got rid of the heavy incubus. I knew that I should have some difficulty in persuading my wife, and I was sure that I should have none so far as the children were concerned. So I decided to constitute them my attorneys. The children readily agreed to my proposal. We do not need these costly presents, we must return them to the community, and should we ever need them, we could easily purchase them. They said. I was delighted. Then you will plead with mother, won't you? I asked them. Certainly, said they. That is our business. She did not need to wear the ornaments. She would want to keep them for us, and if we don't want them, why should she not agree to part with them? But it was easier said than done. You may not need them, said my wife. Your children may not need them. Cajoled they will dance to your tune. I can understand your not permitting me to wear them. But what about my daughters-in-law? They will be sure to need them. And who knows what will happen tomorrow? I would be the last person to part with gifts so lovingly given. And thus the torrent of argument went on, reinforced, in the end, by tears. But the children were adamant. And I was unmoved. I mildly put in, the children have yet to get married. We do not want to see them married young. When they are grown up, they can take care of themselves. And surely we shall not have, for our sons, brides who are fond of ornaments. And if after all, we need to provide them with ornaments, I am there. You will ask me then. Ask you? I know you by this time. You deprive me of my ornaments, you would not leave me in peace with them. Fancy you offering to get ornaments for the daughters-in-law. You who are trying to make sadhus of my boys from today. No, the ornaments will not be returned. And pray what right have you to my necklace? But, I rejoined, is the necklace given you for your service or for my service? I agree. But service rendered by you is as good as rendered by me. I have toiled and moiled for you day and night. Is that no service? You forced all and sundry on me, making me weep bitter tears, and I slaved for them. These were pointed thrusts, and some of them went home. But I was determined to return the ornaments. I somehow succeeded in extorting a consent from her. The gifts received in 1896 and 1901 were all returned. A trust deed was prepared, and they were deposited with a bank, to be used for the service of the community, according to my wishes or to those of the trustees. Often, when I was in need of funds for public purposes, and felt that I must draw upon the trust, I have been able to raise the requisite amount, leaving the trust money intact. The fund is still there, being operated upon in times of need, and it has regularly accumulated. I have never since regretted the step, and as the years have gone by, my wife has also seen its wisdom. It has saved us from many temptations. I am definitely of opinion that a public worker should accept no costly gifts. Chapter 67. In India again. So I sailed for home. Mauritius was one of the ports of call, and as the boat made a long halt there, I went ashore and acquainted myself fairly well with the local conditions. For one night I was the guest of Sir Charles Bruce, the governor of the colony. After reaching India, I spent some time in going about the country. It was the year 1901 when the Congress met at Calcutta under the presidentship of Mr. later Sir Dinshaw Wacha, and I of course attended it. It was my first experience of the Congress. From Bombay I traveled in the same train as Sir Farazesha Mehta, as I had to speak to him about conditions in South Africa. I knew the kingly style in which he lived. He had engaged a special saloon for himself, and I had orders to take my opportunity of speaking to him by traveling in his saloon for one stage. I therefore went to the saloon and reported myself at the appointed station. With him were Mr. Wacha, and Mr. now Sir Chimnalal Setlavad. They were discussing politics. As soon as Sir Farazesha saw me, he said, "Gandhi, it seems nothing can be done for you." "Of course we will. Pass the resolution you want. But what rights have we in our own country? I believe that, so long as we have no power in our own land, you cannot fare better in the colonies. I was taken aback. Mr. Setlavad seemed to concur in the view. Mr. Wacha cast a pathetic look at me. I tried to plead with Sir Farazesha, but it was out of the question for one like me to prevail upon the uncrowned king of Bombay. I contented myself with the fact that I should be allowed to move my resolution. You will of course show me the resolution, said Mr. Wacha, to cheer me up. I thanked him and left them at the next stop. So we reached Calcutta. The president was taken to his camp with great eclat by the reception committee. I asked a volunteer where I was to go. He took me to the Ripon College, where a number of delegates were being put up. Fortune favored me. Lokomania was put up in the same block as I. I have a recollection that he came a day later. And, as was natural, Lokomania would never be without his darbar. Were I a painter, I could paint him. As I saw him seated on his bed, so vivid is the whole scene in my memory. Of the numberless people that called on him, I can recollect today only one, namely the late Babu Motilal Ghose, editor of the Amrita Bazar Patrika. Their loud laughter and their talks about the wrongdoings of the ruling race cannot be forgotten, but I propose to examine in some detail the appointments in this camp. The volunteers were clashing against one another. You asked one of them to do something, he delegated it to another, and he in his turn to a third, and so on. And as for the delegates, they were neither here nor there. I made friends with a few volunteers. I told them some things about South Africa, and they felt somewhat ashamed. I tried to bring home to them the secret of service. They seemed to understand, but service is no mushroom growth. It presupposes the will first, and then experience. There was no lack of will on the part of those good simple-hearted young men, but their experience was nil. The Congress would meet 3 days every year and then go to sleep. What training could one have out of a 3-day show? Once a year? And the delegates were of a piece with the volunteers. They had no better or longer training. They would do nothing themselves. Volunteer, do this, volunteer, do that, were their constant orders. Even here I was face to face with untouchability in a fair measure. The Tamilian kitchen was far away from the rest. To the Tamil delegates even the sight of others, whilst they were dining, meant pollution. So a special kitchen had to be made for them in the college compound, walled in by wickerwork. It was full of smoke which choked you. It was a kitchen, dining room, washroom, all in one, a close safe with no outlet. To me this looked like a travesty of Varnad Harma. If, I said to myself, there was such untouchability between the delegates of the Congress, one could well imagine the extent to which it existed amongst their constituents. I heaved a sigh at the thought. There was no limit to insanitation. Pools of water were everywhere. There were only a few latrines, and the recollection of their stink still oppresses me. I pointed it out to the volunteers. They said point blank, that is not our work, it is the scavenger's work. I asked for a broom. The man stared at me in wonder. I procured one and cleaned the latrine. But that was for myself. The rush was so great, and the latrines were so few, that they needed frequent cleaning, but that was more than I could do. So I had to content myself with simply ministering to myself. And the others did not seem to mind the stench and the dirt. But that was not all. Some of the delegates did not scruple to use the verandas outside their rooms for calls of nature at night. In the morning I pointed out the spots to the volunteers. No one was ready to undertake the cleaning, and I found no one to share the honor with me of doing it. Conditions have since considerably improved, but even today thoughtless delegates are not wanting who disfigure the Congress camp by committing nuisance wherever they choose, and all. The volunteers are not always ready to clean up after them. I saw that, if the Congress session were to be prolonged, conditions would be quite favorable for the outbreak of an epidemic. Chapter 68. Clerk and Bearer. There were yet 2 days for the Congress session to begin. I had made up my mind to offer my services to the Congress office in order to gain some experience. So as soon as I had finished the daily ablutions on arrival at Calcutta, I proceeded to the Congress office. Babu Bhupendranath Basu and Sjt Ghoshal were the secretaries. I went to Bhupen Babu and offered my services. He looked at me and said, I have no work, but possibly Gosal Babu might have something to give you. Please go to him. So I went to him. He scanned me and said with a smile, I can give you only clerical work. Will you do it? Certainly, said I am here to do anything that is not beyond my capacity. That is the right spirit, young man, he said. Addressing the volunteers who surrounded him, he added, do you hear what this young man says? Then turning to me he proceeded, "Well then, here is a heap of letters for disposal. Take that chair and begin. As you see, hundreds of people come to see me. What am I to do? Am I to meet them, or am I to answer these busybodies inundating me with letters? I have no clerks to whom I can entrust this work. Most of these letters have nothing in them, but you will please look them through. Acknowledge those that are worth it, and refer to me those that need a considered reply." I was delighted at the confidence reposed in me. Sjt Ghoshal did not know me when he gave me the work. Only later did he inquire about my credentials. I found my work very easy, the disposal of that heap of correspondence. I had done with it in no time, and Sjt Ghoshal was very glad. He was talkative. He would talk away for hours together. When he learned something from me about my history, he felt rather sorry to have given me clerical work. But I reassured him, "Please don't worry. What am I before you? You have grown gray in the service of the Congress, and are as an elder to me. I am but an inexperienced youth. You have put me under a debt of obligation by entrusting me with this work. For I want to do Congress work, and you have given me the rare opportunity of understanding the details. To tell you the truth," said Sjt Ghoshal, "that is the proper spirit. But young men of today do not realize it. Of course I have known the Congress since its birth. In fact I may claim a certain share with Mr. Hume in bringing the Congress into being. And thus we became good friends. He insisted on my having lunch with him. Sjt Ghoshal used to get his shirt buttoned by his bearer. I volunteered to do the bearer's duty, and I loved to do it, as my regard for elders was always great. When he came to know this, he did not mind my doing little acts of personal service for him. In fact he was delighted, asking me to button his shirt. He would say, "You see, now, the Congress Secretary has no time even to button his shirt. He has always some work to do." Sjt Ghoshal's naivete amused me, but did not create any dislike in me for service of that nature. The benefit I received from this service is incalculable. In a few days I came to know the working of the Congress. I met most of the leaders. I observed the movements of stalwarts like Gokhale and Surendranov. I also noticed the huge waste of time there. I observed too, with sorrow even then, the prominent place that the English language occupied in our affairs. There was little regard for economy of energy. More than one did the work of one, and many an important thing was no one's business at all. Critical as my mind was in observing these things, there was enough charity in me, and so I always thought that it might, after all, be impossible to do better in the circumstances, and that saved me from undervaluing any work. Chapter 69. In the Congress. In the Congress at last. The immense pavilion and the volunteers in stately array, as also the elders seated on the dais, overwhelmed me. I wondered where I should be in that vast assemblage. The presidential address was a book by itself. To read it from cover to cover was out of the question. Only a few passages were therefore read. After this came the election of the Subjects Committee. Gokhale took me to the committee meetings. Sir Farazesha had of course agreed to admit my resolution, but I was wondering who would put it before the Subjects Committee, and when. For there were lengthy speeches to every resolution, all in English to boot, and every resolution had some well-known leader to back it. Mine was but a feeble pipe amongst those veteran drums, and as the night was closing in, my heart beat fast. The resolutions coming at the fag end were, so far as I can recollect, rushed through at lightning speed. Everyone was hurrying to go. It was 11 o'clock. I had not the courage to speak. I had already met Gokhale, who had looked at my resolution. So I drew near his chair and whispered to him, "Please do something for me." He said, "Your resolution is not out of my mind. You see the way they are rushing through the resolutions. But I will not allow yours to be passed over." "So we have done," said Sir Farazesha Mehta. No, there is still the resolution on South Africa." "Mr. Gandhi has been waiting long," cried out Gokhale. "Have you seen the resolution?" asked Sir Farazesha. "Of course. Do you like it?" "It is quite good." "Well then, let us have it, Gandhi." I read it trembling. Gokhale supported it. "Unanimously passed," cried out everyone. "You will have 5 minutes to speak to it, Gandhi," said Mr. Wacha. The procedure was far from pleasing to me. No one had troubled to understand the resolution. Everyone was in a hurry to go, and, because Gokhale had seen the resolution, it was not thought necessary for the rest to see it or understand it. The morning found me worrying about my speech. What was I to say in 5 minutes? I had prepared myself fairly well, but the words would not come to me. I had decided not to read my speech but to speak extempore. But the facility for speaking that I had acquired in South Africa seemed to have left me for the moment. As soon as it was time for my resolution, Mr. Wacha called out my name. I stood up. My head was reeling. I read the resolution somehow. Someone had printed and distributed amongst the delegates copies of a poem he had written in praise of foreign emigration. I read the poem and referred to the grievances of the settlers in South Africa. Just at this moment Mr. Wacha rang the bell. I was sure I had not yet spoken for 5 minutes. I did not know that the bell was rung in order to warn me to finish in 2 minutes more. I had heard others speak for half an hour or 3/4 of an hour, and yet no bell was rung for them. I felt hurt and sat down as soon as the bell was rung. But my childlike intellect thought then that the poem contained an answer to Sir Pharazesha. There was no question about the passing of the resolution. In those days there was hardly any difference between visitors and delegates. Everyone raised his hand and all resolutions passed unanimously. My resolution also fared in this wise and so lost all its importance for me. And yet the very fact that it was passed by the Congress was enough to delight my heart. The knowledge that the imprimatur of the Congress meant that of the whole country was enough to delight anyone. Chapter 70. Lord Curzon's Darbar. The Congress was over, but as I had to meet the Chamber of Commerce and various people in connection with work in South Africa, I stayed in Calcutta for a month. Rather than stay this time in a hotel, I arranged to get the required introduction for a room in the India Club. Among its members were some prominent Indians, and I looked forward to getting into touch with them and interesting them in the work in South Africa. Gokhale frequently went to this club to play billiards, and when he knew that I was to stay in Calcutta for some time, he invited me to stay with him. I thankfully accepted the invitation, but did not think it proper to go there by myself. He waited for a day or two and then took me personally. He discovered my reserve and said, "Gandhi, you have to stay in the country, and this sort of reserve will not do. You must get into touch with as many people as possible. I want you to do Congress work." I shall record here an incident in the India Club, before I proceed to talk of my stay with Gokhale. Lord Curzon held his darbar about this time. Some Rajas and Maharajas who had been invited to the darbar were members of the club. In the club I always found them wearing fine Bengali dhotis and shirts and scarves. On the darbar day they put on trousers befitting khansamas and shining boots. I was pained and inquired of one of them the reason for the change. "We alone know our unfortunate condition. We alone know the insults we have to put up with, in order that we may possess our wealth and titles," he replied. "But what about these khansama turbans and these shining boots?" I asked. "Do you see any difference between khansamas and us?" he replied, and added, "They are our khansamas, we are Lord Curzon's khansamas. If I were to absent myself from the levee, I should have to suffer the consequences. If I were to attend it in my usual dress, it would be an offense. And do you think I am going to get any opportunity there of talking to Lord Curzon? Not a bit of it." I was moved to pity for this plainspoken friend. This reminds me of another darbar. At the time when Lord Hardinge laid the foundation stone of the Hindu University, there was a darbar. There were Rajas and Maharajas of course, but Pandit Malaviyaji specially invited me also to attend it, and I did so. I was distressed to see the Maharajas bedecked like women, silk pajamas and silk achkans, pearl necklaces round their necks, bracelets on their wrists, pearl and diamond tassels on their turbans, and besides all the swords with golden hilts hanging from their waistbands. I discovered that these were insignia not of their royalty, but of their slavery. I had thought that they must be wearing these badges of impotence of their own free will, but I was told that it was obligatory for these Rajas to wear all their costly jewels at such functions. I also gathered that some of them had a positive dislike for wearing these jewels, and that they never wore them, except on occasions like the darbar. I do not know how far my information was correct, but whether they wear them on other occasions or not, it is distressing enough to have to attend viceregal darbars in jewels that only some women wear. How heavy is the toll of sins and wrongs that wealth, power and prestige exact from man. Chapter 71. A month with Gokhale. From the very first day of my stay with him, Gokhale made me feel completely at home. He treated me as though I were his younger brother. He acquainted himself with all my requirements and arranged to see that I got all I needed. Fortunately my wants were few, and I had cultivated the habit of self-help. I needed very little personal attendance. He was deeply impressed with my habit of fending for myself, my personal cleanliness, perseverance and regularity, and would often overwhelm me with praise. He seemed to keep nothing private from me. He would introduce me to all the important people that called on him. Of these the one who stands foremost in my memory is Dr. now Sir P.C. Ray. He lived practically next door and was a very frequent visitor. This is how he introduced Dr. Ray. This is Professor Ray, who, having a monthly salary of 800 rupees, keeps just 40 rupees for himself and devotes the balance to public purposes. He is not, and does not, want to get married. I see little difference between Dr. Ray as he is today and as he used to be then. His dress used to be nearly as simple as it is, with this difference of course that whereas it is khadi now, it used to be Indian milkcloth in those days. I felt I could never hear too much of the talks between Gokhale and Dr. Ray, as they all pertained to public good or were of educative value. At times they were painful too, containing as they did, strictures on public men. As a result, some of those whom I had regarded as stalwart fighters began to look quite puny. To see Gokhale at work was as much a joy as an education. He never wasted a minute. His private relations and friendships were all for public good. All his talks had reference only to the good of the country and were absolutely free from any trace of untruth or insincerity. India's poverty and subjection were matters of constant and intense concern to him. Various people sought to interest him in different things, but he gave every one of them the same reply: you do the thing yourself. Let me do my own work. What I want is freedom for my country. After that is we can think of other things. Today that one thing is enough to engage all my time and energy. His reverence for Ranade could be seen every moment. Ranade's authority was final in every matter, and he would cite it at every step. The anniversary of Ranade's death, or birth, I forget which, occurred during my stay with Gokhale, who observed it regularly. There were with him then, besides myself, his friends Professor Cathavate and a sub-judge. He invited us to take part in the celebration, and in his speech he gave us his reminiscences of Ranade. He compared incidentally Ranade, Telung and Mandalik. He eulogized Telung's charming style and Mandalik's greatness as a reformer. Citing an instance of Mandalik's solicitude for his clients, he told us an anecdote as to how once, having missed his usual train, he engaged a special train so as to be able to attend the court in the interest of his client. But Ranade, he said, towered above them all, as a versatile genius. He was not only a great judge, he was an equally great historian, an economist and reformer. Although he was a judge, he fearlessly attended the Congress, and everyone had such confidence in his sagacity that they unquestioningly accepted his decisions. Gokhale's joy knew no bounds, as he described these qualities of head and heart which were all combined in his master. Gokhale used to have a horse carriage in those days. I did not know the circumstances that had made a horse carriage a necessity for him, and so I remonstrated with him. Can't you make use of the tramcar in going about from place to place? Is it derogatory to a leader's dignity? Slightly pained, he said, so you also have failed to understand me. I do not use my counsel allowances for my own personal comforts. I envy your liberty to go about in tramcars, but I am sorry I cannot do likewise. When you are the victim of as wide a publicity as I am, it will be difficult, if not impossible, for you to go about in a tramcar. There is no reason to suppose that. Everything that the leaders do is with a view to personal comfort. I love your simple habits. I live as simply as I can, but some expense is almost inevitable for a man like myself. He thus satisfactorily disposed of one of my complaints, but there was another which he could not dispose of to my satisfaction. But you do not even go out for walks, said I. Is it surprising that you should be always ailing? Should public work leave no time for physical exercise? When do you ever find me free to go out for a walk? He replied. I had such a great regard for Gokhale that I never strove with him. Though this reply was far from satisfying me, I remained silent. I believed then and I believe even now, that, no matter what amount of work one has, one should always find some time exercise, just as one does for one's meals. It is my humble opinion that, far from taking away from one's capacity for work, it adds to it. Chapter 72. A month with Gokhale, too. Whilst living under Gokhale's roof, I was far from being a stay-at-home. I had told my Christian friends in South Africa that in India I would meet the Christian Indians and acquaint myself with their condition. I had heard of Babu Kalicharan Banerjee and held him in high regard. He took a prominent part in the Congress, and I had none of the misgivings about him that I had about the average Christian Indian, who stood aloof from the Congress and isolated himself from Hindus and Muslims. I told Gokhale that I was thinking of meeting him. He said, "What is good of your seeing him? He is a very good man, but I am afraid he will not satisfy you. I know him very well. However, you can certainly meet him if you like. I sought an appointment, which he readily gave me. When I went, I found that his wife was on her deathbed. His house was simple. In the Congress I had seen him in a coat and trousers, but I was glad to find him now wearing a Bengal #Dhoti and shirt. I liked his simple mode of dress, though. I myself then wore a Parsi coat and trousers. Without much ado I presented my difficulties to him. He asked, "Do you believe in the doctrine of original sin?" "I do," said I. "Well then, Hinduism offers no absolution therefrom, Christianity does," and added, "The wages of sin is death, and the Bible says that the only way of deliverance is surrender unto Jesus." I put forward #Bhaktimarga the path of devotion, of the #Bhagavad-Gita but to no avail. I thanked him for his goodness. He failed to satisfy me, but I benefited by the interview. During these days I walked up and down the streets of Calcutta. I went to most places on foot. I met Justice Mitter and Sir Gidas Banerjee, whose help I wanted in my work in South Africa. And about this time I met Raja Sir Pyaramahan Mukherjee. Kalicharan Banerjee had spoken to me about the Kali temple, which I was eager to see, especially as I had read about it in books. So I went there one day. Justice Mitter's house was in the same locality, and I therefore went to the temple on the same day that I visited him. On the way I saw a stream of sheep going to be sacrificed to Kali. Rows of beggars lined the lane leading to the temple. There were religious mendicants too, and even in those days I was sternly opposed to giving alms to sturdy beggars. A crowd of them pursued me. One of such men was found seated on a veranda. He stopped me and accosted me, "Whither are you going, my boy?" I replied to him. He asked my companion and me to sit down, which we did. I asked him, "Do you regard this sacrifice as religion?" "Who would regard killing of animals as religion?" "Then, why don't you preach against it?" "That's not my business. Our business is to worship God." "But could you not find any other place in which to worship God?" "All places are equally good for us. The people are like a flock of sheep, following where leaders lead them. It is no business of us #sadhus #da. We did not prolong the discussion but passed on to the temple. We were greeted by rivers of blood. I could not bear to stand there. I was exasperated and restless. I have never forgotten that sight. That very evening I had an invitation to dinner at a party of Bengali friends. There I spoke to a friend about this cruel form of worship. He said, "The sheep don't feel anything. The noise and the drum beating their deaden all sensation of pain." I could not swallow this. I told him that, if the sheep had speech, they would tell a different tale. I felt that the cruel custom ought to be stopped. I thought of the story of Buddha, but I also saw that the task was beyond my capacity. I hold today the opinion as I held then. To my mind the life of a lamb is no less precious than that of a human being. I should be unwilling to take the life of a lamb for the sake of the human body. I hold that, the more helpless a creature, the more entitled it's to protection by man from the cruelty of man. But he who has not qualified himself for such service is unable to afford to it any protection. I must go through more self-purification and sacrifice before I can hope to save these lambs from this unholy sacrifice. Today I think I must die pining for this self-purification and sacrifice. It is my constant prayer that there may be born on earth some great spirit, man or woman, fired with divine pity, who will deliver us from this heinous sin, save the lives of the innocent creatures, and purify the temple. How is it that Bengal, with all its knowledge, intelligence, sacrifice, and emotion tolerates this slaughter? Chapter 73. A Month with Gokhale, 3. The terrible sacrifice offered to Kali in the name of religion enhanced my desire to know Bengali life. I had read and heard a good deal about the Brahmo Samaj. I knew something about the life of Pratap Chandra Mazumdar. I had attended some of the meetings addressed by him. I secured his Life of Keshav Chandra Sen, read it with great interest, and understood the distinction between Sadharan Brahmo Samaj and Adi Brahmo Samaj. I met Pandit Shivnath Shastri and in company with Professor Kathavate went to see Maharshi Devendranath Tagore, but as no interviews with him were allowed then, we could not see him. We were, however, invited to a celebration of the Brahmo Samaj held at his place, and there we had the privilege of listening to fine Bengali music. Ever since I have been a lover of Bengali music. Having seen enough of the Brahmo Samaj, it was impossible to be satisfied without seeing Swami Vivekanand. So with great enthusiasm I went to Belur Math, mostly, or maybe all the way, on foot. I loved the sequestered sight of the Math. I was disappointed and sorry to be told that the Swami was at his Calcutta house, lying ill, and could not be seen. I then ascertained the place of residence of Sister Nivedita, and met her in a Chowringhe mansion. I was taken aback by the splendor that surrounded her, and even in our conversation, there was not much meeting ground. I spoke to Gokhale about this, and he said he did not wonder that there could be no point of contact between me and a volatile person like her. I met her again at Mr. Pastanji Padshah's place. I happened to come in just as she was talking to his old mother, and so I became an interpreter between the two. In spite of my failure to find any agreement with her, I could not but notice and admire her overflowing love for Hinduism. I came to know of her books later. I used to divide my day between seeing the leading people in Calcutta regarding the work in South Africa, and visiting and studying the religious and public institutions of the city. I once addressed a meeting, presided over by Dr. Mullick, on the work of the Indian Ambulance Corps in the Boer War. My acquaintance with #the Englishman # stood me in good stead on this occasion. 2. Mr. Saunders was ill then, but rendered me as much help as in 1896. Gokhale liked this speech of mine, and he was very glad to hear Dr. Ray praising it. Thus my stay under the roof of Gokhale made my work in Calcutta very easy, brought me into touch with the foremost Bengali families, and was the beginning of my intimate contact with Bengal. I must needs skip over many a reminiscence of this memorable month. Let me simply mention my flying visit to Burma, and the #Fungis there. I was pained by their lethargy. I saw the golden pagoda. I did not like the innumerable little candles burning in the temple, and the rats running about the sanctum brought to my mind thoughts of Swami Dayanand's experience at Morvi. The freedom and energy of the Burmese women charmed just as the indolence of the men pained me. I also saw, during my brief sojourn, that just as Bombay was not India, Rangoon was not Burma, and that just as we in India have become commission agents of English merchants, even so in Burma have we combined with the English merchants, in making the Burmese people our commission agents. On my return from Burma I took leave of Gokhale. The separation was a wrench, but my work in Bengal, or rather Calcutta, was finished, and I had no occasion to stay any longer. Before settling down I had thought of making a tour through India traveling third class, and of acquainting myself with the hardships of third-class passengers. I spoke to Gokhale about this. 2. Begin with he ridiculed the idea, but when I explained to him what I hoped to see, he cheerfully approved. I planned to go first to Benares to pay my respects to Mrs. Besant, who was then ill. It was necessary to equip myself anew for the third-class tour. Gokhale himself gave me a metal tiffin box and got it filled with sweet balls and #Puris #. I purchased a canvas bag worth 12 annas and a long coat made of chaya wool. The bag was to contain this coat, a #Dodi #, a towel, and a shirt. I had a blanket as well to cover myself with and a water jug. Thus equipped I set forth. On my travels, Gokhale and Dr. Ray came to the station to see me off. I had asked them both not to trouble to come, but they insisted. I should not have come if you had gone first class, but now I had to, said Gokhale. No one stopped Gokhale from going on to the platform. He was in his silk turban, jacket and #Dodi #. Dr. Ray was in his Bengali dress. He was stopped by the ticket collector, but on Gokhale telling him that he was his friend, he was admitted. Thus with their good wishes I started on my journey. Chapter 74. In Benares. The journey was from Calcutta to Rajkot, and I planned to halt at Benares, Agra, Jaipur and Banalpur en route. I had not the time to see any more places than these. In each city I stayed one day and put up in dharmashalas or with pandas like the ordinary pilgrims, excepting at Palanpur. So far as I can remember, I did not spend more than 31 rupees, including the train fare, on this journey. In traveling third class I mostly preferred the ordinary to the mail trains, as I knew that the latter were more crowded and the fares in them higher. The third-class compartments are practically as dirty, and the closet arrangements as bad, today as they were then. There may be a little improvement now, but the difference between the facilities provided for the first and the third classes is out of all proportion to the difference between the fares for the two classes. Third-class passengers are treated like sheep and their comforts are sheep's comforts. In Europe I traveled third and only once first, just to see what it was like, but there I noticed no such difference between the first and the third classes. In South Africa class comforts are better there than here. In parts of South Africa third-class compartments are provided with sleeping accommodation and cushioned seats. The accommodation is also regulated, so as to prevent overcrowding, whereas here I have found the regulation limit usually exceeded. The indifference of the railway authorities to the comforts of the third-class passengers, combined with the dirty and inconsiderate habits of the passengers themselves, makes third-class traveling a trial for a passenger of cleanly ways. These unpleasant habits commonly include throwing of rubbish on the floor of the compartment, smoking at all hours and in all places, betel and tobacco, chewing, converting of the whole carriage into a spittoon, shouting and yelling, and using foul language, regardless of the convenience or comfort of fellow passengers. I have noticed little difference between my experience of the third-class traveling in 1902 and that of my unbroken third-class tours from 1915 to 1919. I can think of only one remedy for this awful state of things: that educated men should make a point of traveling third class and reforming the habits of the people, as also of never letting the railway authorities rest in peace, sending in complaints wherever necessary, never resorting to bribes or any unlawful means for obtaining their own comforts, and never putting up with infringements of rules on the part of anyone concerned. This, I am sure, would bring about considerable improvement. My serious illness in 1918-19 has unfortunately compelled me practically to give up third-class traveling, and it has been a matter of constant pain and shame to me, especially because the disability came at a time when the agitation for the removal of the hardships of third-class passengers was making fair headway. The hardship of poor railway and steamship passengers, accentuated by their bad habits, the undue facilities allowed by government to foreign trade, and such other things, make an important group of subjects, worthy to be taken up by one or two enterprising and persevering workers who could devote their full time to it. But I shall leave the third-class passengers at that, and come to my experience in Benares. I arrived there in the morning. I had decided to put up with a panda. Numerous Brahmins surrounded me as soon as I got out of the train, and I selected one who struck me to be comparatively cleaner and better than the rest. It proved to be a good choice. There was a cow in the courtyard of his house and an upper story where I was given a lodging. I did not want to have any food without ablution in the Ganges in the proper orthodox manner. The panda made preparations for it. I had told him beforehand that on no account could I give him more than a rupee in 4 annas as dakshina, and that he should therefore keep this in mind while making the preparations. The panda readily assented. "Be the pilgrim rich or poor," said he, "the service is the same in every case. But the amount of dakshina we receive depends upon the will and the ability of the pilgrim." I did not find that the panda at all abridged the usual formalities in my case. The puja was over at 12 o'clock, and I went to the Kashi Vishwanath temple for darshan. I was deeply pained by what I saw there. When practicing as a barrister in Bombay in 1891, I had occasion to attend a lecture in pilgrimage to Kashi in the Prarthana Samaj Hall. I was therefore prepared for some measure of disappointment. But the actual disappointment was greater than I had bargained for. The approach was through a narrow and slippery lane. Quiet there was none. The swarming flies and the noise made by the shopkeepers and pilgrims were perfectly insufferable. Where one expected an atmosphere of meditation and communion, it was conspicuous by its absence. One had to seek that atmosphere in oneself. I did observe devout sisters, who were absorbed in meditation, entirely unconscious of the environment. But for this the authorities of the temple could scarcely claim any credit. The authorities should be responsible for creating and maintaining about the temple a pure, sweet and serene atmosphere, physical as well as moral. Instead of this I found a bazaar where cunning shopkeepers were selling sweets and toys of the latest fashion. When I reached the temple, I was greeted at the entrance by a stinking mass of rotten flowers. The floor was paved with fine marble, which was however broken by some devotee innocent of aesthetic taste who had set it with rupees, serving as an excellent receptacle for dirt. I went near the Jnanavapi, well of knowledge. I searched here for God but failed to find him. I was not therefore in a particularly good mood. The surroundings of the Jnanavapi too I found to be dirty. I had no mind to give any dakshina, so I offered a pie. The panda in charge got angry and threw away the pie. He swore at me and said, "This insult will take you straight to hell." This did not perturb me. "Maharaj," said I, "whatever fate has in store for me, it does not behove one of your class to indulge in such language. You may take this pie if you like, or you will lose that too." "Go away," he replied, "I don't care for your pie." And then followed a further volley of abuse. I took up the pie and went my way, flattering myself that the Brahmin had lost a pie and I had saved one. But the Maharaj was hardly the man to let the pie go. He called me back and said, "All right, leave the pie here, I would rather not be as you are. If I refuse your pie, it will be bad for you." I silently gave him the pie and, with a sigh, went away. Since then I have twice been to Kashi Vishwanath, but that has been after I had already been afflicted with the title of Mahatma, and experiences such as I have detailed above had become impossible. People eager to have my darshan would not permit me to have a darshan of the temple. The woes of Mahatmas are known to Mahatmas alone. Otherwise the dirt and the noise were the same as before. If anyone doubts the infinite mercy of God, let him have a look at these sacred places. How much hypocrisy and irreligion does the Prince of Yogis suffer to be perpetrated in his holy name? He proclaimed long ago, "Whatever a man sows, that shall he reap." The law of karma is inexorable and impossible of evasion. There is thus hardly any need for God to interfere. He laid down the law and, as it were, retired. After this visit to the temple, I waited upon Mrs. Besant. I knew that she had just recovered from an illness. I sent in my name. She came at once. As I wished only to pay my respects to her, I said, "I am aware that you are in delicate health. I only wanted to pay my respects. I am thankful that you have been good enough to receive me in spite of your indifferent health. I will not detain you any longer." So saying, I took leave of her. Chapter 75. Settled in Bombay. Gokhale was very anxious that I should settle down in Bombay, practice at the bar and help him in public work. Public work in those days meant Congress work, and the chief work of the institution which he had assisted to found was carrying on the Congress administration. I liked Gokhale's advice, but I was not overconfident of success as a barrister. The unpleasant memories of past failure were yet with me, and I still hated as poison the use of flattery for getting briefs. I therefore decided to start work first at Rajkot. Kavaram Mavji Dave, my old well-wisher, who had induced me to go to England, was there, and he started me straightaway with 3 briefs. 2 of them were appeals before the judicial assistant to the political agent in Kathiawad, and 1 was an original case in Jamnagar. This last was rather important. On my saying that I could not trust myself to do it justice, Kavaram Dave exclaimed, "Winning or losing is no concern of yours. You will simply try your best, and I am of course there to assist you." The counsel on the other side was the late S.J.T. Samarth. I was fairly well prepared. Not that I knew much of Indian law, but Kavaram Dave had instructed me very thoroughly. I had heard friends say, before I went out to South Africa, that Sir Farazesha Mehta had the law of evidence at his fingertips, and that was the secret of his success. I had borne this in mind, and during the voyage had carefully studied the Indian Evidence Act with commentaries thereon. There was of course also the advantage of my legal experience in South Africa. I won the case and gained some confidence. I had no fear about the appeals, which were successful. All this inspired a hope in me that after all I might not fail even in Bombay. But before I set forth the circumstances in which I decided to go to Bombay, I shall narrate my experience of the inconsiderateness and ignorance of English officials. The judicial assistant's court was peripatetic. He was constantly touring, and vakils and their clients had to follow him wherever he moved his camp. The vakils would charge more whenever they had to go out of headquarters, and so the clients had naturally to incur double the expenses. The inconvenience was no concern of the judge. The appeal of which I am talking was to be heard at Veraval, where plague was raging. I have a recollection that there were as many as 50 cases daily in the place with a population of 5,500. It was practically deserted, and I put up in a deserted #Dharmashala hashtag at some distance from the town. But where the clients to stay? If they were poor, they had simply to trust themselves to God's mercy. A friend who also had cases before the court had wired that I should put in an application for the camp to be moved to some other station because of the plague at Veraval. On my submitting the application, the Sahib asked me, "Are you afraid?" I answered, "It is not a question of my being afraid. I think I can shift for myself, but what about the client?" "The plague has come to stay in India," replied the Sahib. "Why dear it? The climate of Veraval is lovely." The Sahib lived far away from the town in a palatial tent pitched on the seashore. Surely, people must learn to live thus in the open. It was no use arguing against this philosophy. The Sahib told his Shirastadar, "Make a note of what Mr. Gandhi says, and let me know if it is very inconvenient for the vakils or the clients." The Sahib of course had honestly done what he thought was the right thing. But how could the man have an idea of the hardships of poor India? How was he to understand the needs, habits, idiosyncrasies and customs of the people? How was one, accustomed to measure things in gold, sovereigns, all at once to make calculations in tiny bits of copper? As the elephant is powerless to think in the terms of the ant, in spite of the best intentions in the world, even so is the Englishman powerless to think in the terms of, or legislate for, the Indian. But to resume the thread of story. In spite of my successes, I had been thinking of staying on in Rajkot for some time longer, when one day Kavaram Dev came to me and said, "Gandhi, we will not suffer you to vegetate here. You must settle in Bombay. But who will find work for me there?" I asked. "Will you find the expenses?" Yes, I will," said he. "We shall bring you down here sometimes as a big barrister from Bombay, and drafting work we shall send you there. It lies with us vakils to make or mar a barrister. You have proved your worth in Jamnagar and Veraval, and I have therefore not the least anxiety about you. You are destined to do public work, and we will not allow you to be buried in Kathiawad. So tell me, then, when you will go to Bombay." "I am expecting a remittance from Natal. As soon as I get it I will go," I replied. The money came in about 2 weeks, and I went to Bombay. I took chambers in Payne, Gilbert, and Sayani's offices, and it looked as though I had settled down. Chapter 76. Faith on its trial. Though I had hired chambers in the fort and a house in Gurgaon, God would not let me settle down. Scarcely had I moved into my new house when my second son Manilal, who had already been through an acute attack of smallpox some years back, had a severe attack of typhoid, combined with pneumonia and signs of delirium at night. The doctor was called in. He said medicine would have little effect, but eggs and chicken broth might be given with profit. Manilal was only 10 years old. To consult his wishes was out of the question. Being his guardian, I had to decide. The doctor was a very good Parsi. I told him that we were all vegetarians and that I could not possibly give either of the two things to my son. Would he therefore recommend something else? "Your son's life is in danger," said the good doctor. "We could give him milk diluted with water, but that will not give him enough nourishment. As you know, I am called in by many Hindu families, and they do not object to anything I prescribe. I think you will be well advised not to be so hard on your son." "What you say is quite right," said I. "As a doctor you could not do otherwise. But my responsibility is very great. If the boy had been grown up, I should certainly have tried to ascertain his wishes and respected them. But here I have to think and decide for him. To my mind it is only on such occasions that a man's faith is truly tested. Rightly or wrongly, it is part of my religious conviction. That man may not eat meat, eggs, and the like. There should be a limit, even means of keeping ourselves alive. Even for itself we may not sow certain things. Religion, as I understand it, does not permit me to use meat or eggs for me or mine even on occasions like this, and I must therefore take the risk that you say is likely. But I beg of you one thing. As I cannot avail myself of your treatment, I propose to try some hydropathic remedies which I happen to know. But I shall not know how to examine the boy's pulse, chest, lungs, etc. If you will kindly look in from time to time to examine him and keep me informed of his condition, I shall be grateful to you." The good doctor appreciated my difficulty and agreed to my request. Though Manilal could not have made his choice, I told him what had passed between the doctor and myself and asked him his opinion. "Do try your hydropathic treatment," he said. "I will not have eggs or chicken broth." This made me glad, though I realized that, if I had given him either of these, he would have taken it. I knew Kuhn's treatment and had tried it too. I knew as well that fasting also could be tried with profit. So I began to give Manilal hip baths according to Kuhn, never keeping him in the tub for more than 3 minutes, and kept him on orange juice mixed with water for 3 days. But the temperature persisted, going up to 104. At night he would be delirious. I began to get anxious. What would people say of me? What would my elder brother think of me? Could we not call in another doctor? Why not have an Ayurvedic physician? What right had the parents to inflict their fads on their children? I was haunted by thoughts like these. Then a contrary current would start. God would surely be pleased to see that I was giving the same treatment to my son as I would give myself. I had faith in hydropathy and little faith in allopathy. The doctors could not guarantee recovery. At best they could experiment. The tread of life was in the hands of God. Why not trust it to him and in his name go on with what I thought was the right treatment? My mind was torn between these conflicting thoughts. It was night. I was in Manilal's bed lying by his side. I decided to give him a wet sheet pack. I got up, wetted a sheet, wrung the water out of it, and wrapped it about Manilal, keeping only his head out, and then covered him with 2 blankets. To the head I applied a wet towel. The whole body was burning like hot iron, and quite parched. There was absolutely no perspiration. I was sorely tired. I left Manolo in the charge of his mother, and went out for a walk on Chapati to refresh myself. It was about 10 o'clock. Very few pedestrians were out. Plunged in deep thought, I scarcely looked at them. My honor is in thy keeping, O Lord, in this hour of trial, I repeated to myself. #Ramanama was on my lips. After a short time I returned, my heart beating within my breast. No sooner had I entered the room than Manolo said, "You have returned, Bapu?" "Yes, darling. Do please pull me out. I am burning." "Are you perspiring, my boy?" "I am simply soaked. Do please take me out." I felt his forehead. It was covered with beads of perspiration. The temperature was going down. I thanked God. "Manolo, your fever is sure to go now. A little more perspiration and then I will take you out." "Pray, no. Do deliver me from this furnace. Wrap me some other time if you like." I just managed to keep him under the pack for a few minutes more by diverting him. The perspiration streamed down his forehead. I undid the pack and dried his body. Father and son fell asleep in the same bed, and each slept like a log. Next morning Manolo had much less fever. He went on thus for 40 days on diluted milk and fruit juices. I had no fear now. It was an obstinate type of fever, but it had been got under control. Today Manolo is the healthiest of my boys. Who can say whether his recovery was due to God's grace, or to hydropathy, or to careful dietary and nursing? Let everyone decide according to his own faith. For my part, one was sure that God had saved my honor, and that belief remains unaltered to this day.